Welcome to this presentation, Improve Your Meetings Through Robert's Rules of Order. Henry Robert was a Union general and developed the original version of these rules of order. The 12th edition is the latest, and the 3rd edition of the In Brief is a summary. The presentation today is based mostly on content of the In Brief version. The In Brief version is very user-friendly and ironically uses a meeting example where the topic of focus is the creation of a junior tennis league. If you are interested in learning a lot more detail about Robert's Rules, I highly recommend you purchase the 3rd edition In Brief. Finally, RO&R refers to Robert's Rules of Order newly revised. Our presentation will cover the following: what RO&R aims to accomplish, how RO&R accomplishes its aims, where RO&R fits within organizations relative to laws, customs, and practicality. The meat of the presentation will be on how to apply RO&R in standard meetings. We will then finish by answering a few common questions and then open it up for questions and comments. Robert's Rules has two broad aims. The first is to ensure that all meeting participants have a voice, but to do so in an organized way. A second and related aim is to provide a meeting format that allows issues to be discussed and decisions made in an efficient way and save time. So how does RO&R accomplish its aims? Who speaks when and for how long? By having rules concerning order and length of speech, the rules help to avoid people talking over each other or speaking too long. Germaneness is a significant consideration, and it involves keeping discussions focused on the topic at hand. By keeping discussions focused and not drifting, organizations can make decisions more quickly. Finally, having a clear decision process allows for matters to be dispensed with rather than going around and around indefinitely. Where does RO&R fit within organizations? First, organizations must follow all local, state, and federal laws. Next, organizations have governing rules that are embodied in their bylaws. Often, states have requirements concerning necessary components of bylaws, and sometimes these bylaws mention Robert's Rules, but not necessarily. In terms of procedural processes, the main thing is that organizations have processes. It isn't necessary they follow Robert's Rules, but they should have some understanding about how they're going to conduct meetings and make decisions. If they don't, it's a recipe for having meetings that take more time than necessary while getting less done. I recommend that organizations consider and settle on what makes sense for them. RO&R is here to help, but an organization may have customs that differ from RO&R, and as long as everyone understands the customs and procedures of the organization, that's the main thing. This is relevant to D, or the size of meetings. How to best conduct a meeting can differ based on the size of the meeting. If you have a large meeting, then a more defined and firm process may matter more than having a small meeting or, say, a committee meeting with few people at a coffee shop. Finally, every organization has customs and how it operates, and these customs are usually not written down. For example, the presentation today may present you with a different way of, say, approving minutes. You're not obligated to follow the RO&R approach, but just realize that through the years, the RO&R methods have proven to be efficient and effective. Okay, let's move on to how to apply RO&R in a standard meeting. We will cover normal meeting procedures and considerations, but not delve into unusual or infrequent situations. Beginning of official meeting. For a meeting to be official, there are certain requirements. First, an officer to run the meeting must be present. In addition, the secretary or another officer to take minutes must also be present. In terms of a quorum, before a meeting begins, the chair or presiding officer and not the secretary need to observe who's in attendance and whether a quorum is present. But what is a quorum? A quorum is a majority of voting members. It is not 1/2 plus 1. For example, imagine you have 17 voting members. Literally 1/2 is 8.5 members, so 1/2 plus 1 comes to 9.5 members. In this case, a majority would be 9. Now what if you don't have a quorum? Then those in attendance could set another meeting time or adjourn until a quorum is present. Once a quorum is present, the presiding officer calls the meeting to order by simply saying the meeting will come to order. Now under R&R, there's a standard order of business, which is likely familiar to many of you, and we've covered each of these. Reading and approval of minutes, reports of officers, boards, and standing committees, reports of special ad hoc committees, special orders, unfinished business and general orders, and new business. After the call to order, the meeting moves to the reading and approval of minutes. A key question to consider is what does and doesn't go into the minutes. The main thing to remember is that the minutes focus on what was done and not what was said. Keeping this in mind makes taking minutes easier, as many of us don't relish taking minutes, and not having to write down what everyone said makes the job easier. Under the normal procedure, the secretary would actually read the minutes before approval, but if the minutes were shared before the meeting, then there's no need to read the minutes. The presiding officer then asked if there are corrections to the minutes. Usually there are no corrections. At this point, the presiding officer indicates that the minutes are approved. There is no need for a motion and second to approve the minutes. On the other hand, if there are corrections to the minutes, this is handled through a motion. We'll get to motion shortly. For now, let's assume the minutes have been approved. Minutes taken at one meeting get approved at the next regularly scheduled meeting, and normally this is at least each quarter. However, if it is anticipated that there will be a longer than usual gap between meetings, then the minutes should be read and approved at the meeting where they are taken. After the approval of minutes, the meeting progresses to the reports of officers, boards, and committees. Usually officers will not make reports, except from time to time an officer may report on some administrative duties they've undertaken. For example, an officer may report on progress in recruiting additional board members. All reports should be in writing unless they are very short or in a meeting with a small group. So in the case of officers' report, there would likely be no need to speak if, say, they were just recruiting some new members, and that was already in the report. In terms of delivery, it's best to share the report beforehand so members can read it. Reports should contain relevant facts and recommendations, and not what was said, and should also be stated in third person. The committee recommends some measure rather than Tim recommends a measure. A treasurer's report takes place at every meeting and can be as short as indicating how much money the organization has, or can go into more detail. For example, if the organization conducted a fundraiser, then indicating specifics. There's also an annual treasurer's report that goes into more detail about how closely income and expenses match their budgeted amounts. Discussion in theory and practice. In theory, the main function of a meeting is to announce, debate, and vote on recommendations. Discussion of the issue at hand and related issues is to take place in committee. In reality, board members may want to discuss topics during the general meeting that are related to the committee reports but not being voted on. For example, imagine a committee report that simply indicates that the committee is exploring venue options for a fundraiser. A board member may have an alternative recommendation after reading the committee report. Here, the presiding officer should make a decision beforehand. First, either discussion takes place during new business at the end of the meeting or during the meeting itself. As a practical matter, as a presiding officer, my preference is to say something like, does anyone have any comments or questions about the fundraising report? And do this during the meeting and not wait until the end. The important thing is to keep the discussion from taking too much time. If the meeting agenda is too full, then I would reserve discussion until the end. Now we are moving on to committee reports. Note that standing committees are those you maintain, and ad hoc committees are those that come into existence for a specific purpose, like an event committee. It isn't necessary that each committee report each time. Committee report format. Again, the committee report focuses on what was done and less on what was said. However, it can include the rationale for the recommendations it makes. The committee report should be in writing, just like officers' reports. There is no need to read the report or have anyone present unless a motion is to be made. Special orders come next, where applicable. A special order is a topic that is of significant importance to be discussed during a meeting. The effect of having a special order is to focus attention on the topic, and this is achieved by setting a time for initiating discussion of the topic. The setting of the time is firm, and any other business being conducted at the appointed time is postponed until unfinished business and general orders, which occurs later in the meeting. If a meeting moves faster than scheduled so that special orders is reached before the appointed time, then the topic may be taken up if 2/3 of the assembly vote to take it up early. Otherwise, the meeting moves to the next topic on the agenda and comes back to special orders at the designated time. When a meeting concerns a singular topic, then special orders may be taken up immediately after the minutes are read. So at such a meeting, there would be no officers or committee reports. Let's move on to motions. Motions are often used in situations where they are not needed, like immediately preceding a vote. Context is important. If you are part of a small board that is involved in everything, then your situation is different than that of a large organization with numerous committees and clear divisions of responsibility. This means that for small organizations, the process I'm about to describe may take place in one meeting. For larger organizations, the development of ideas and recommendations take place during committee meetings. Per what was previously said, the facts and committee recommendations are then shared during the board meeting, where the committee will share this information and debate it with the larger assembly and have a vote. The purpose of a motion is to clearly state a recommendation so it can be discussed if necessary and then voted on. There's no need to make a motion to approve a proposal. The purpose of the motion is to initiate discussion of the proposal. Here's an example of the motion procedure. Let's assume it is a meeting of a community tennis association. The CTA has gone through the process of determining quorum, call to order, reading minutes, and has reached the committee reports part of the agenda. There's a difference between individual motions and those by committee. Individual motions require a second. For example, I stand or raise my hand to indicate I would like to speak. The chair recognizes me. I speak, make a motion, which is a recommendation, for example, for the CTA to provide $2,000 in support of the creation of a middle school tennis league and to pay for equipment and coaches. Once I state the motion, the chair asks if there is a second. The purpose of the second is just to say the topic is worth discussing, not that the second agrees with it. After the second, whoever is presiding over the meeting allows the person who made the motion to speak on its behalf, or someone else to speak on its behalf. That person gets up to 10 minutes. When that person is finished, the presiding officer asks if there are those who would like to express opposition to the proposal. This person also gets up to 10 minutes, and they continue in this fashion until there's no one left who wishes to express an opinion. Note, there is no such thing as yielding back minutes or giving them to someone else. Committee recommendations are different. Imagine there's a schools committee that is making a recommendation. Again, let's say that in the report the committee voted to recommend that the CTA financially support the creation of a middle school tennis league with $2,000 to be used to pay for equipment and coaches. Since the recommendation came from the committee itself, a member of that committee can simply read or state the exact recommendation, and then the presiding officer will ask if anyone would like to speak in support of the recommendation. There's no need for a second here. Usually it'll be the person who read the recommendation. After the person speaks, the presiding officer asks if there's anyone opposed to the recommendation who would like to speak, and then we go from there. Okay, let's move to voting procedure. There is a procedure to voting. After everyone appears to have spoken on the motion, the presiding officer asks, is there any further debate? If nobody rises or raises their hand to claim the floor, the chair puts the question or proceeds to a vote. At this point, the chair reads the motion exactly without paraphrasing it. If someone believes what the chair has read is not accurate, they must stand or raise their hand to raise a point of order in which they explain what correction is needed. The next step is to have a vote and tally it by saying all in favor of the proposed motion say aye. After voting members respond, the presiding officer says all those opposed to the motion say nay. Based on which one clearly has more voices, the presiding officer determines whether or not the motion passed. If the vote is close, there may be a need to use another method to determine how the vote went. One is for a show of hands. The presiding officer can have someone count the hands for and against a measure to determine the outcome. Note that some items require 2/3 vote, such as bylaw changes. The presiding officer then announces the result, and there are 4 components of this announcement. The first is to indicate which side has it. Next, whether the motion has been adopted or lost. And this is followed by what the effect of the motion is, and finally what the next steps are. Note at this stage, the chair should immediately transition to the next order of business or risk individuals sidetracking the meeting by wanting to discuss or debate the topic further. Unfinished business and general orders comes next. Normally, this agenda item is just unfinished business, but technically the topic includes general orders, which is somewhat complex. But essentially, this agenda item is specific in that it involves unresolved agenda items, questions, and motions from previous meetings. This means that the presiding officer does not ask, is there any unfinished business? Instead, the presiding officer says the first item of unfinished business is, and then they take up the unfinished business items in the agenda order from the previous meeting. These topics and their order should be in written form in the agenda given or sent to meeting participants beforehand. It is important to note that unfinished business items will arise from one or more motions to postpone that occurred during a meeting. In one scenario, you can imagine a meeting scheduled for an hour, and at the hour mark, there are still items on the agenda to discuss. One might make a motion to postpone discussion of the items until the next meeting, at which point the items would be taken up. In a way, the motion to postpone is more useful in the context of a meeting that is spending too much time discussing a particular topic. Here, someone can make a motion to postpone discussion. It could be taken up later in the meeting once other business is attended to or doing the new business component of the current meeting. Alternatively, one could make a motion to postpone until the next meeting. This is a useful tool toward keeping meetings on schedule while acknowledging the importance of continuing discussion of the topic. New business and adjournment. This is a time to discuss tabled items. After any tabled items have been discussed, or if there are no tabled items, the chair asks if there is other new business. This is a chance for people to bring up other topics. Once these other topics have been discussed, the chair once again asks if there's any other new business. And if there isn't, they say the meeting is adjourned. Okay, let's move on to common questions. Virtual and telephone meetings. There are a few points to keep in mind. First, they're only valid if they're allowed in the bylaws. Also, be sure that attendees are able to hear each other and actively participate. Further, think through the process for voting and communication order. For virtual meetings, the use of a chat box is helpful as it prevents people from talking over one another. Another common question concerns adding items to the agenda. While the president or presiding officer creates a draft agenda, they don't set the official agenda. The agenda becomes official when it is approved at the beginning of a meeting. This means that if someone wants to add an item to the agenda, that person can do so when the agenda is presented at the meeting. Alternatively, if the draft agenda was presented beforehand, individuals could make a motion to add items to the agenda. And now we'll move on to other questions.